So we're going to, oh, I need the rest of my tabs here. We're going to be talking about the context API, as you know. And I've already received a few questions about this on the subject of why do we even learn state and props when this seems so much easier, so much cleaner, so much better? And there's a couple reasons for that. So context, even though in the small examples that we've seen so far here in Training Kit, does seem way easier, right? Seems way more straightforward, way cleaner. I agree. But there are, when you start to get into large applications, you will start to run into problems with context API. So let's take a look at that. Here is a section in the docs that Leslie linked us to in a chat this morning. Oh, that's not what I wanted. There's our Zoom link. Oh, I think I have to go up to here. Sure. Okay. There you go. So before you use context, this is just inside the context API docs. You can go to right down here before you use context. So this gives us a really good introduction to what context is used for and when not to use it, which is also important. So it says context is primarily used when some data needs to be accessible by many components at different nesting levels. But here's the caveat: apply it sparingly because it makes component reuse more difficult. So the hope when we're building components in React is that we can make them dynamic, reusable. So if we ever have a use case for that specific component, again, it's easy to just plug and play, right? As long as you pass it the correct data. So that's the keyword there, passing it the correct data. Let me show you what I mean. Is there any blank spots here? Let's maybe go to, let's go to here. Okay, this is gonna be our whiteboard for today. All right, so let's say we've got an app. It's not gonna be too complicated. It's just gonna have two different component trees inside of it, like this. And then we've got another component tree over here. And this goes down a few levels as well. All right, so let's say we've got data A that we're bringing in from an API, setting it to state here. Data A is used down here, but not in any of the intermediary components. So we could just pass this down as props all the way down to this lower component here. Or, as you've learned today, we can wrap this entire component tree in a provider, a context provider, and pass data A into the value prop for this provider component. And then we can access that data here using the context hook and the context object, so that we don't have to pass this down all of these levels here. Okay, so this is called, when we're passing some data down level to level to level and not using it in these intermediary components, this is called prop drilling. And that's the main problem that context is trying to solve, is this idea of prop drilling. All right, so we've brought in context API. We can grab our data many levels down without passing it through a bunch of components along the way. And this provider component is wrapped around this component tree here. So what happens if we want to take this component that we just built and plug it in down here? Remember, if we want to make a component dynamic and kind of plug and play, you have to be able to pass in the correct data. Well, this component is not receiving data via props. The easiest way to plug and play with React components is to make sure you pass in the correct props from the component that is rendering that component from its parent component. However, this is receiving data A through this provider. So now that we're using that component down here in this component tree, there's a couple things we might have to do. Might have to, you'd have to wrap this in a provider and pass in the same context object, and then you can use the context hook and the context object down here. Some people might want to wrap the entire app now in this provider and be able to access that data here and down here. So without, since we're using context to get data A from here to here, it makes it a lot harder for us to just reuse that component over here. Yeah, we're gonna have to restructure a lot of things. Whereas if we had just used props and state, it would have been a lot easier to just call the data, make an API call here and pass it in as props. Or even up here and pass it through as props down to this level. So there are some considerations to make when you're choosing to use context API. Keep in mind that it is harder to reuse components that are receiving their data from a context object rather than just from props. So, okay. If you've got questions on that, please put it on Slido. We'll get to questions here in a few minutes. But let's just take a look at how we use context API and kind of the standard syntax for that. We're gonna start in Code Sandbox. Woo! Our best friend that is sometimes difficult to work with. Okay, so I'm going to start a new Code Sandbox here. I'll post it here. Okay, so Jonathan started our questions thread right here. Thank you, Jonathan. Oh, this is the TL question thread. Yeah, TL question thread. My comment thread will be in this one here. Threading. Ooh, thread, please. I like the color version. We've upgraded. Okay, so let's talk about what or how we use the context API. We're going to do this first inside this just one file. So we're going to have multiple components here, and we're going to even build our context object here. Usually this will all be separated into separate files, but we're just going to look at the syntax right now. All right, so let's do this. We're going to change our header to family tree. We'll go ahead and take away this. And we're going to set up some states. We're going to say const family, family, set family equals use state. And we're going to pass in a family state object here. Okay, so let's define our family tree. So we're going to say const family data, and let's see. I'm trying to think of. Okay, let's just use, what's a good family tree that we can use? I can just use mine, but if someone has a good one. I'm trying to think of Star Wars, but that only goes, well, we don't know. That might go a third level here. Simpsons is a good one. I don't know the Simpsons very well, so help me out. Let's start with grandparents. Grandpa. The Addams Family. Grandpa Abe, okay. Hey, yes, very helpful. Family tree. Oh, I love it. So where's Bart? Holy cow. Okay, I found Homer. This gets very, very deep. Okay, so Grandpa Abe, we'll start with Grandpa Abe. We'll even say Grandpa Abe. It seems like that was the name for him. Then we have, let's say, father is, see, I'm so bad at this, Homer. Don't make fun of me. Homer Simpson. Good. Mother is Marge, right? Marjorie? Marge. I'll just say Marge Simpson. And son. Art Simpson. Okay. There's probably a more nested way that we could set this up. We could say grandparents and have an array of strings. Parents have an array of strings. Children, array of strings. But this will be good enough for our family data here to get the concept. Okay, so we're going to initialize our family state object with family data. So we have our Simpson family here. We probably won't need to be changing this data, so we're just going to go ahead and delete our setter. We don't need it. Okay, let's start from the top. So we're going to create a grandpa component, and this is going to take in some props, and it's going to return and render some data or some JSX. Wow, typing is hard today. Okay, so first thing we're going to render here is, let's do some H3s with props dot family dot grandpa. Okay, so that's what our grandpa component is going to look like. Let's go ahead and render grandpa right here. And we need to pass in the family state object. Okay, there's Grandpa Abe. Yay, we've listed Grandpa Abe. But Grandpa Abe had children, and so we're going to render mother, and we're going to render father here. All right, so let's go build mother and father components. Oh, what happened? Copy, paste. Okay, and mother and father are both going to need the family object as well. So we're going to say props.family and pass that object through to mother. So mother is going to render props.family.mother. And then we'll do the same thing for our father. We have father, mother, props. Oh, we didn't pass in. See, it's saying that the cannot read property father of undefined. So props.family is undefined. So where do we define props? Right here. Of course it's undefined because we don't have a family prop being passed to father. Oh, family. Hey, there we go. Grandpa Abe, Marge, and Homer. I think it's proper that the mother renders the son component. So we're going to go down here. We're going to say son and props.family.son. Okay, then we need to pass the family prop in here. And there we go. We've got our Simpson family tree. Yay. But you'll notice that there are a lot of props that we are passing through. We are using these props all the way down. But we're still passing them down many levels to render our data down here. So we're going to set up a context object, and we're going to practice putting this family data into the provider component that's going to wrap this entire family tree, this component tree here. And then instead of getting our data from props, we're going to consume the data from the context object. So to get this started, let's do this. Let's go to here. And we're going to do driver navigator. Okay. So how do we want to start? What do we need to introduce context into this app? Yes, we need the create context object or function from React. Okay, so we're going to import that in from React. Let's close this since we don't need those. Then we need to create a context object using create context. Usually we would create a context folder. For this example, we're just going to see it all in one file. And then our next example, we're going to break things out into their own files. All right, create a context object using create context, and then, and import use context. So we'll get to the use context in a second. Let's create a context object. We're going to do that down here. Const, what should we call our context object? And how do we create a context object with the create context function? Okay, I like it. Simpsons context. Good. You could say family context, family tree, family context. Yes, create context. Perfect. So you could do it with React, like Raku's showing us here, if you didn't want to import create context. You could just call it off of the React object, react.create context, or you can import it, oops, wrong line, and call it like that. Nice, thank you, Rocky. Okay, we've got our context object. What is a context object? Who knows what has just been created? Should we console log it and find out? I love console logging stuff, especially when I don't know what it is. Just console log it. Ooh, it's not a component. Really good guess, though. You're really close. Yeah, let's console log this. It's an object, context object, with 2 components on it. So it has 2 components on it. So this is an object. 2 of its properties are components that we can actually render inside our component tree. But if we're going to render a component, let's say we want to wrap this component tree inside our context object. Don't we need this to be capitalized? If this isn't capitalized, then the compiler is going to think that that we're looking for, or it's going to try and render an HTML element, not a custom React component. So when we create context objects, we usually capitalize them so we can do this and render our provider component like that. Yeah, and as you guys have mentioned, it's a way to collect data, store state. Let's take a look at the console again once we finish wrapping this like that. Okay, so we've wrapped our entire component tree inside our provider component. Now, we can do this. Sometimes you'll have global state where you're inside app component wrapping context providers around your entire application. Maybe that's because you have someone who's logging into your system and you get a user object back for the person that's using the software, for your user, and you need their data throughout the entire application. So things like that where they're global data for the entire app, we would do that, set that up in app or somewhere on the higher global level. A lot of times you're going to have context for maybe you'll just wrap it around mother, around a smaller part of your app. So a specific component tree needs this data, and so you set up context for that specific component tree. For this one, obviously we need family data available to all of this entire component tree. Okay, so you can see here that there are some other values here. Current value, thread count. You can click into these and get sucked into this everlasting black hole of component context things here. Not sure why it's set up that way. But yeah, you can keep drilling down and drilling down. When we pass, let's see what happens when we pass a value, when we pass our data to this provider. Let's see how this changes. Actually, we'll probably need to console log that. Well, this will actually be easier to look at in the React Dev Tools. Ooh, if they work here, that would be so cool. Come on. Okay, so we may have to open this up in another window, but let's get our data to our provider. How do we pass our family data to our provider component? Yes, our provider component takes a value prop. Love it. So we're going to pass family in. This is the data we're trying to access within this component tree. So we're going to go ahead and pass that down, pass that into value on the provider component. Okay, now let's see if we have loading for days. Okay, let's just open this up in a new window. Now let's open up our React Dev Tools. Okay, so we've got our app component, right? Here's our app component that's being rendered through the render function. So here's our app component. Inside our app component, we have our provider that's wrapping the rest of our component tree. So you can see that happening here. Inside app, we have our context.provider. So if we click on context.provider, we can see the value prop that we passed in that has all of our family members here. Okay, so we pass that in to provider. All of these are receiving that same data as props. But we want to retrieve and consume that data through the context object, not through props. Okay, we're going to come back. Let's take a look at some questions. We'll come back and talk about consuming data after we take a short break and answer some questions in the reverse order. Answer questions, then take a short break. Then we'll get into a little bit more complicated example with context. All right, let's go ahead and stop this poll. Do you have to download an NPM dependency to use context API? Great question. Is there someone that would like to help out our fellow student here? How do we access context API? Is it an NPM dependency? Perfect, Jason, thank you. It is part of React. It's part of the, it's already built into React. So as you can see here, we imported create context from React. In a minute, we're going to import use context from React as well. So anything that you're importing from React, that means you don't have to add an extra dependency. Thank you, thank you. Crowdsourcing answers makes my job easier. Is there a difference between wrapping index.js app import with the context provider, i.e. how we use React Router, or is wrapping the app.js file component with the context provider different? Really good question. So what Rocky is asking is, can we take this provider component and can we wrap that around this? Now, you'll usually see the provider component wrapped inside the app, inside your component, not inside where it's imported, because the reason we're using context is to get this data passed to it, which is usually on state. So if I took my provider, wrapped it around app right here, I wouldn't be able to access this state. And so I wouldn't be able to pass the value down. So usually it's going to be inside your JSX here and not at the import-export section. Great question. Okay, let's take a 5-minute break and I'll see you back in a few minutes. Hey, come on back. Let's get started. Or finish this example. We're doing work. That's what we're doing. Okay. So we've got our Simpson family tree. We've created our context object, passed in our data to our provider. Now we can, inside this component tree here, we can consume that data in any of our components that we want to. So let's go ahead and let's do this. We're gonna leave Grandpa here alone. We're gonna let him take in props for the family. We're going to leave father alone, but mother and son, we're going to consume this data via the context object. I have no specific reason as to why some components are consuming it with context and some with props, other than to show you that both still work within the same component tree. So everything you've learned up to this point is still definitely valid. But yeah, so let's start with mother here. We're going to consume the family object through context instead of through props. So we're going to take props away, and we need something here. We won't have props to pass the family object down to son, so we're going to take that away as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with consuming that data inside mother. So let me drag this back over and get back onto this one here. Okay. All right, what is the first step to consuming data through the context object that we just created inside this nested component here? Ooh, thank you, Moses. So we need a couple pieces here. We need a use context hook. We need to make sure we have access to the Simpsons context object. And then we're going to pass that context object into the use context hook and capture the value of whatever it's returning here in some variable. So let's say const, as Moses did for us, family context. Now we need to import the use context hook. So I'm going to say use context. We would usually, if our context object was set up in a different file, then we would need to import the context object into our mother.js file, right? So we would usually have to import our context object. We have it available here in this file, so we don't need to import it. But we still need to call use context and pass in our Simpsons context object like so. Okay, let's set this up. If you go to Sun, take away props and take away that, then we should be good. Get past that error so we can see this work. Okay, now how do we get to Marge Simpson? We want this string right here. How are we going to access that in mother? What is family context here? Ah, good, yes. But I'm going to rewind for a second. What is this family context variable that we just set up? What is the value of family context? It's an object, good. Yes, family data. It's whatever we passed in right here, right? It's our family state object, which is family data. So whatever we pass into value on our provider gets pulled out as the value to this variable when we call use context and pass in that context object. So let's see if we can do this. So here's our provider. Let me do this. Let's see. Okay, so family, our state, gets passed into our provider. And that value is what comes out right here. As long as we're using the same context object there. So there's a little visualization for you. Typing is hard and speaking is hard. Oh, don't we love Mondays? Yes. Whew, okay. All right, so we've got the view of what's going on. We can even console log family context. And we'll see that it is indeed that object that we passed into value up here. Okay, so since we have that object here for family context, as a few of you mentioned, we can say family context.mother to get to Marge Simpson string that we're trying to render here in our family tree. So let's say family context.mother. Yay, there's Marge. Woohoo! And drag this back down. Ah, haha. Come on. No. You're killing me. There it is. Okay. if this happens to be an object, this does not have to be an object. Sometimes it's a string, sometimes it's an array of data. A lot of times it is going to be an object because you're going to pass an object of data down to many different components, but it's not always that way. If the value that you're passing into provider is an object, that means we can destructure that object and pull the data off of it. So a lot of times instead of getting the entire object here inside mother, a lot of times you'll see React developers say, all we need is the mother prop from this object. So I'm just going to destructure mother off of here and render that. So this is usually the pattern that you're going to see from with the use context hook. So let's repeat that with son. We're going to call the same use context hook, pass in Simpsons. This time we're going to grab the son property and render Bart Simpson there. It's kind of a funny way to Grandpa, Marge, Bart, Homer. That doesn't look like a family tree. I think if we switch father up here, we get Bart at the bottom. Yay, we've now used context. Woohoo! It's working. It's working. By the way, this is like the most for now that you'll need to know about context. You could take this, what we've just practiced and learned, and go finish your afternoon project with this information. So the rest of our lecture today is going to be looking at a little bit more complicated use for context. We're actually going to use it inside a custom hook, and then use that custom hook inside our components. But that's not, you won't need to go that, you won't need to use it in that way for your afternoon project. So this is literally what you're going to do for your afternoon project. You're going to set up a couple context objects, pass in the data, and then consume that data in your children components rather than consuming it via props. So let's see if there are any questions, and then maybe take a break, maybe look at one more example here. Okay, why must we make a new context variable for each component? Isn't mother, for example, wrapped in the original Simpsons context provider, which already has the family data? So you're talking about right here, right? So the reason we have to do this is we have to, even though mother is inside this component tree, it's not like props that gets passed into this function and we just have props available without setting a new variable inside the component. Context, you have to tell your component that you're going to use context for this, for its data, and you have to set up a variable to capture the value here. So it's not automatic like passing props is inside React. You do have to set up this variable here. If we look at mother, you can see that you can actually, why does this have props being passed to it? Did we pass props to it? Yes. Let's take mother away. I was hoping it would show you context, but it's not going to. Rendered by grandpa, rendered by app. View the source code. That's cool. Yeah, there's not really a way to see that mother is consuming data from context. This is another reason that context is actually a little bit harder than using props. It's really hard to follow the trail of the data. When you've got props, so let's go to father here. When you've got props, it's really easy to look at this component and say, okay, I'm getting my data from props.family, so I need to go to where father is rendered. Where's the family prop right here, coming from props.family? Where's grandpa rendered? Here. Here's the family prop. That's where I'm getting my data from. With son, we have to find the Simpsons context where it's defined and where the provider is. So it's a little bit harder to, if these are all split out into different files, it's a little bit harder to, you have to do like a global search for Simpson context.provider, and it's not a clear-cut trail of data like passing props through is. Also, you'll rely so much on the dev tools, the React dev tools, the normal dev tools here when you're building, when you're working for whatever company you get a job at. If I click on father, I can see that props is being passed down. I can look at the component that is rendering father, and I can see that it's getting props, it's being rendered by app, and so it's not receiving props. So I can go to app and find where this family prop data is coming from. So even in the new React Dev tools, you can follow props pretty easily by following this rendered by list here. But with Sun, I don't see the data that's coming through, even though I know there's data being passed down, but this isn't going to help me at all. It will tell me that the context object has to be in one of these three components, right? It has to be in a parent or grandparent and some ancestor component here. So I could use that, but it is a little bit harder. Okay, good question. Ooh, yes, more questions coming in. Do you have to turn family data into a state value for this to work? Or could you pass the original family data? Yeah, also a good question. We didn't have to set up state. I do this because I don't want you ever to get into the habit of grabbing data from a hard-coded thing like this, because usually your data is going to come from an API, and you're going to want to put that data on state so that you can update and manage that data. So yeah, we could definitely do family data, and it's still going to work as expected. And we could pass family data in here. Now we're not even using this state object, but we're still getting all of our data. But again, I would much rather, even if you have to hard code some test data, like let's say you're in build weeks and your backend developer hasn't set up all the endpoints for you to get your data, and that's what you're waiting on. So instead of sitting around for 2 days, which is a lot of time for a build week, right? You don't want to be just sitting there. You should hard code some data like this for what you think it's going to look like when the backend developer sends it to you, but you should still be setting it to state, because that's how it's going to be managed once you get your API in. So even if you're hard coding some data, like some test data or mock data, please just always set it to state. Get into that mindset that any data that this component is going to be using should be managed on state, no matter where it's coming from. Okay, can we access the context variable from other files? If you're talking about this context variable, yes. If you're talking about this context variable, no. So after you use context, you can't export this out of a functional component. The use context hook has to be used inside a functional component. So you can't export that, but you can export this and just call use context in whatever nested child you need. What's the advantage of using use context over the consumer component directly? Ooh, good question. This is what I was going to bring up next. Let's see, 1055. Yeah, we're good. Okay, so let's keep mother the same. This is going to be our example for the context hook. This is going to be the example for, say, use context hook. And this is smiley face. And then this is going to be the example for render props, like maybe a class component or legacy component, etc. This is the old way to do it without hooks. And this is going to get a weary face. Where's my weary face? Here we go. Okay. So let's say you are looking at a legacy code that doesn't have hooks, or a class component where you can't use hooks. You would import Simpsons context. It's already available to us in this component, so we don't need to use that here. Okay, now let me see if I can remember how to do this. All right. So we would import Simpsons context. We would render Simpsons context dot consumer. Like so. Then inside the consumer component, we need to run a function to get the value from our consumer. So when we're going to run a function, we need curly braces, right? We're going to run a function here, and we're going to return some JSX from this function. Now this function that gets called here receives the value prop, whatever was passed into value here. So we'll just call this family, family context. So instead of getting family context here, our object here, we get it from this function. Okay, then we can return our H3, and we can say family context dot son, and there's Bart again. Oh, that's why we have a weary face. Render props, not as fun or clean as hooks. So again, this is the most of the time you're going to be writing it like this. You may see the render props pattern like this, so it's good to see it and recognize it. Recognize that you're getting this data from context. Look what this does though to our component hierarchy. So if we go back over here, all of a sudden, instead of having son here, we have a context.consumer component with our data on it. So son is rendering Bart Simpson, but it's through this consumer component here. So we've now added a completely new layer to our component hierarchy that with hooks you don't need. Real quick before we take a break, let me talk about render props and hooks really fast. So talking about hooks, if we go down to the motivation for hooks, why were hooks invented? The first reason listed is it's hard to reuse stateful logic. So a big part of hooks is to be able to reuse stateful logic between multiple components. The way we managed this problem, the way we solved this problem before hooks was to use render props, which we just saw, and higher order components, which we've seen a little bit with like the with formic higher order component. We'll see a connect higher order component in Redux later this week. So these are two kind of advanced patterns for React before hooks. But there's a but here. But these patterns require you to restructure your components when you use them, which can be cumbersome and make code harder to follow. That is, if we look at this example here, here's mother with the context hook. Here's son with render props pattern. We are, exactly as they're saying, restructuring our component, and it's become more cumbersome and makes the code harder to follow. Look at the difference between those two components. Our son component is definitely more cumbersome and definitely harder to follow. And we've had to restructure our component through with this consumer component. If you look at a typical React application in React DevTools, you'll likely find a wrapper hell of components surrounded by layers of providers, consumers, higher order components, render props, and other abstractions. Yep, we have that going on. This one is, if you're going to use context, this one is unavoidable, but this extra layer here is definitely avoidable if you're using the context hook. While we could filter them out in DevTools, this points to a deeper underlying problem. React needs a better primitive for sharing stateful logic. With hooks, you can extract stateful logic from a component, so it can be tested independently, reused. Hooks allow you to reuse stateful logic without changing your component hierarchy. So, not to beat a dead horse, but this, with our mother component, we didn't need to change our component hierarchy at all. With our son component, we did. We had to introduce a brand new consumer component just to get that value out of our context. So this is a really good example for this first motivation piece in the React hooks docs here. All right, a couple more questions. Can you go over again why the context hooks will make component not usable again? We don't have time to rehash that, but it's the very first part of the video when the recording gets posted. So check it out on the recording when that gets posted. Sorry, I hate that answer, but since we've already gone over that, that's what I'm going to point you to. Are we going to go over the class version as well? So this is basically the class version. If it's inside a class, you have to use the render prop, because you can't call React hooks inside class components. So here is the class version. Why do you have to do const family context use context? Why can't you just do Simpsons context? Because, let's look at that. So if we come here and say console.log Simpsons context inside here, drag this up. Come on. Oh, there we go. We don't have the value anywhere on here. Current value, let's see what current value is. Current value. Undefined, is it a function? Nope. Was it underscore current value? Okay, so we could do this. I wonder if this would change with state changes though. So if our state changes, I wonder if this would not catch the changes. In any event, the use context hook is going to make sure that you're subscribed to those changes. And yeah, I would definitely use the context hook. I'll see if there's a better explanation of why we want to use that hook rather than just the current value here. How do you pass context through separate JS docs? Probably, I think you mean files. We're going to look at that in our next example. So let's take a quick break, and we'll come back and we'll see a little bit more complicated example. We're actually going to break out all of our components and our context object into a separate file. Okay, I'll see you back in 5. Okay, come back to your computers. Let's keep this going. Okay. So we're going to pull off of the Simpsons example. Remember when I didn't even remember Homer Simpson's name and I had to look it up on that chart? Oh, so embarrassing. All right. So we're going to start with this sandbox here. And then, I don't know why package.lock.json would be, that's weird. Okay, here's the tutorial that this comes from. It's a really cool tutorial, fun little project. So let's take a look at what we have. We're going to build this out a little differently than what that tutorial does, but that's okay. You can look at that tutorial in the README for just another example for setting up your context provider than what we're going to do. Okay, so let's take a look at this project. We have our app. We've got a state object with a few different things going on here. So we've got a nested array of tracks. So we've got the Lost Chameleon. We've got a file, Lost Chameleon, which is being imported from our assets. So this is a MP3 file. These are all MP3 files. And we've got those being listed here. Rock, Tobu, and Lost Chameleon. Okay, also on our state object, we have an audio player where we're setting up a new audio player using the audio constructor, which is a browser API. We've got current track index. So this is going to tell us what the current track is that is active. Not necessarily playing because we can pause the music here. So it'll just give us the title of the current track down here. And we're going to use that for like when we want to skip to the next track. We're going to find out what the next track is based on our current track index. Then we also want to know if we currently are playing music. So this is whether we're paused or playing or not. All right, so there is our state. We've got a couple different components here, track list, which is importing use music player from our hooks. And then going to get our music object from use music player, map over our track list from use music player, and display our track list from there. So let's start at this point. Let's work on getting our track list to our music object here. So we've called use music player. We're console logging what that returns. So let's take a look at our console log. So this is our music object from our use music player hook. Oh, cool. You can hover over it and see what is there as well. So we've got some functions here: play track, toggle track, play previous track, play next track. We've got current track index, current track name, track list. So that's what we're looking for right here. Music.track_list right now is an empty array, and then is playing is false. So let's see if we can populate this track list from here. So instead of passing this down as a prop, what we're going to do is set up a context object, and we're going to add this state object to our context object. So build a new directory here. We're going to call this contexts. And then inside here, we're going to have music context.js. Okay, once you get to that point, then you're going to, for the next 4 or 5 minutes, you're going to build a music context object here. So you're going to import, use context, create, and export a music context object. Once you do that, then inside app, let's do that. I'll just comment the tasks here. Import music context and wrap the component tree inside the provider component. Pass the state object to the provider's value prop. Okay, so 4 steps. 2 inside music context, 2 inside app. If you need to refork to get up to this point, feel free to refork off of my code sandbox, or just build this contexts folder and music context file. Let me split this down and up here. Okay. So there are the 4 tasks in the comments here. All right, let's go for 4 minutes, and then we'll come back together and do this on my end. Hey, let's see what you came up with. Who would like to help me? Let's see. Let's do this. Let's start a live session. And let's see if this time we can get a volunteer to do this live for the class. Would anybody like to come in here and code this live? Oh, good point there. Don't import use context, import create context. That was a trick question. Hopefully you caught that. Thank you, Emma. All right, anybody want to do this live for the class? We'll help you through it. Andrew, okay, have you joined up on here? Oh, I haven't shared my link. Of course you haven't. Okay, we'll wait for Andrew. There you are, you're a spectator, but I'm going to make you an editor. So go ahead and jump into music context. And let's start with, we'll just take these one at a time. So step 1, import create context. Look at that, that's so cool. Okay, so we're importing create context from React. Yes, good. Okay, so let's create and export a music context object. Nice, nice. See how fast he types? I don't know if that was just lag on my end or it looked like copy and paste. But let's take away this space right here. Good. Okay. Yeah, this is about the most that we'll have in our context files. I'm going to pause you there for a second, Andrew, and open up my README, command click. The other thing you can do inside your context files is, let's go, right here. So the other thing you can do in your context files is create your context object, like we've done there, but you can also create a provider component that you export, and you can render your provider here, and then just render props.children. And then you wrap your provider component right here, music player provider. And yeah, that is the other way you can create this context file. So just a heads up on that, we're going to do it a little bit differently than this tutorial, but there is a different way that you could do it if you'd like. All right, well done on creating our context object, Andrew, yay. Now let's come into app and let's import music context and then wrap our component tree with the provider component. Nice. Okay, so we've got our music component, our music context object here. Now let's come down here and wrap our tree with our provider. Okay, so we call music context.provider. And then we're going to pass in a value prop with the state object that we're creating right here. Perfect. Oh, and it gave you a lot of extra stuff there. Oh, that was fun. Nice, perfect. Yes, round of applause for Andrew. Woo! Let's give Andrew some emoji love. In WEB22. That was very well done. Good job. And super props for doing that in front of all of your peers here in WEB22. That is always a tough thing to do, and you did awesome. So I'm now going to kick you out of here, and you're back to a spectator. All right. Awesome. Awesome, 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 awesome. Okay, so we have our music context provider wrapping our state tree here. Let's go to track list, and let's just the state object that we're passing to context has these tracks. So if we wanted to, we could come to track list and we could import music context from our contexts / music context file. And then we could call use context inside here, const, and get track list. Oh, track list from use context with music context passed in. Then, if we just map over this, what is our problem here? It doesn't like track list from music context. Is that what it's called here? Tracks. That's what it's called. That's why. Tracks and tracks. There we go. Hey, we've got our track list. So that's one way. This is what you're going to do in your project. This is usually how you're going to use create context. But instead, with this project, we actually have this use music player hook that's going to keep that. This is where we're going to call use context, and we're going to get that state, this state object from the context provider here inside use music player. So we're going to set this up. This is going to be really cool. We'll finish this after a quick break. Doesn't look like we have any questions pending, so let's go ahead and take our break and come back and finish this little project. Okay, come on back. Let's finish this up. All right, by the way, there are some people getting like a cross-origin error. This just means that there's some error that happened that we don't have access to right away. And usually so React doesn't have access to the actual error in development. So usually you have to wrap, you have to use an error boundary. So React error boundary, just to see what the error is. I don't know why this is a thing in React, but it is. Oops, that's the one we want. So there's error boundaries. Basically, you create this component here and then called error boundary. So you can just copy and paste this into a file in your React app and then wrap it around whatever error, whatever component is giving you that error. Then it will actually it'll display the error for you in your console. So, however, so if you see that in your projects, then that's what you're going to have to do. Usually with Code Sandbox, you can just open the project in a different window and you'll see the actual error in your console. So usually if you see that in Code Sandbox happening, just open it in a different window. You'll probably see the error here. If you still don't see the error, then you'll have to go the error boundaries route. Okay. So we talked about how we want use music player to give our track list component the tracks. So we're actually going to walk back what we did. So we're going to remove tracks here. And we don't need music context. Okay, so we've got use music player here, and music.tracklist is going to render our track list. But right now, music.tracklist is an empty array. So let's go into use music player. Since we are calling use music player inside this component tree, we still have access to the context object. So we can go to our hook, use music player hook. We can import use context from React. We can import our context object, music context from .. Oh, let's put strings on that. Contexts. Context. There we go. / music context. Then up here we're going to call. We're going to say const. What are we going to call this? We're just going to call this state and set state. Equals use context. And pass in music context. But our value that we passed into our music context isn't this array. It's an object, our state object, right? So let's go back to app, and we're going to pass in for our value. Our value is now going to be state and set state passed in as an array. So instead of just passing in the state object, we're going to pass in an array with state and set state from right here. So inside app, value needs to be that array. That way, inside our use music player, we can get state and set state from the context object. I'm just going to close these down and move this out of the way. We'll go back to use music player here. Okay, so by consuming music content, context data, the value prop that we passed in, we get state and set state out of use context, music context. So that means on our state, we have state.tracks. We can say state.tracks. And now let's go look. Aha! Now we have our track list. This is now coming through because inside the use music player hook, we're returning this object with a track list prop that's receiving state.tracks from here. So state.tracks gets added to track list inside use music player. Track list calls use music player. So music.tracklist is this list here. Okay, let's see what else we have. So current track index. Let's pop this out to the right. Split right. So what else do we have on this object that we can just place over here? Current track index, current track index. So let's say state dot current track index. Current track name. How are we going to get current track name? Any idea on how we get current track name here? Let's see. Let me go back to this thread. How can we get our current track name? Nope, we don't have, so state is, oh, let me slide this over a bit. State is this object here, and we don't have a current track name property here. So we have to do a little bit of JavaScript. If we have current track index, we can do something like this. So use the current track index on the tracks array. So we're going to say state.tracks, which is an array. And then whatever our current track index is, it'll be 0, 1, or 2. That's what our current track index will be. So we're going to say state.tracks at state.current track index. So it's going to look like that. Okay, is playing. We're not just going to say false. We're going to grab that from state.isPlaying. And then we have our for functions, which we need to complete the logic for up here. But we have everything else we need on this state object. Oh, .name, thank you. Yes. We don't want this just to be the entire object. We want it to be .name. Okay, so let's start with play track. So first of all, let's go see where play track is used. So inside track list, do we have play track? Aha, right here. So inside our track list, oh, now we're getting some problems. Scroll up, cannot read property name of undefined. Music player. Aha. Okay, the reason we're getting this error, if we don't have a current, if state.currentTrackIndex is null, if we haven't chosen a song to play, then this is going to come back as null, and it's going to give us this error, cannot read, where's my console? Cannot read property name of undefined. So this is going to come back as undefined. and then undefined does not have a name. So we first need to check to see if this is a thing, and then we're going to grab that name. So this is just a shortcut way to, it's called short circuiting. We're gonna make sure that this is defined. If this is not defined, we're not even gonna run this code. If this is defined, go ahead and grab the name. Okay, and we're back, good. Okay, so we've got our list of songs here. We wanna be able to click the play button, which is right here. So font awesome play button. We should be able to click on that and play our track. So here's the play track function from our use music player. You can see that we're taking in the index because we're passing that index in. So let's go make this so it will play some music. You're going to learn a little bit about the audio API today, which is kind of cool. Okay, so let's just check to see, first of all, if we click this button and Lost Chameleon is already playing, then we actually want our music to pause. So we're first going to see if the index we clicked on is the current track index, and if we're playing music, then we're going to toggle that music being played. So we're first going to check to see if, well, we'll solve that. We'll solve that afterwards. Let's first solve just playing a track. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to say state dot audio player, which is this audio object here. We're going to create a brand new audio player to override this audio player. So we're going to say this equals a new audio, like that. And we're going to pass in the track, this file right here. So we're going to go to the track at the index we passed in and pass in this file to that audio object. So we're going to say state.tracks at whatever our index is, whatever we passed in here, file. This will set up a new audio object with whichever audio file we just clicked on. Okay, now we can take that audio player. So we're going to say state dot audio player dot play. So let's see what this does. Hey, there we go. Ah! We have lots of songs going on. Every time we click on this button, it's going to create a new audio player object on top of our old audio player object and start playing that music. So we first want to, since that's happening, we first want to take whatever song is currently playing and pause that song. So now let's try. Cool. It works good. Yay. But what else do we want to do in here? If we click on play, then we want to inform our UI that we're playing this song, right? So we want this to change to the pause button. Let's go see what it's going to take to change this to the pause button. So we're going to go to track list. If the music is playing and the current track index matches the music, the object here that's being rendered, then we want to display the pause button. So we have to tell our state object that music is playing, and we have to give it the current track index. So let's go back to our use music player, and we're going to call set state with, we're going to spread in all of our old state. We're going to say current track index is the index. And we're going to say is playing is true. Oop. Okay, so we're going to update this state, calling set state calls this function here, and it's going to update all of these, which in turn will update all of these, which in turn will update this music object here. Okay, so is playing in the UI that we actually want it to be where it's important here is going to get toggled when we click on that. Oh, but we don't have his pause. We don't have pause functionality working yet. So let's go fix this new one. We're going to fix that new functionality. And that's the if statement that we started to build up here. So first we're going to say if the index that we passed in equals the state.currentTrackIndex, we're going to call the toggle play function. So now we need to figure out toggle play. All right, so toggle play, pretty easy. If we are playing music, we just want to pause the music. If we're not playing music, then we want to play the music. Okay, I typed that out really fast, so I'll give you a chance to catch up on this if statement here and the toggle play function here. Now, once we play or pause our audio player, we also need to set state with is playing. So we need to toggle our state.isPlaying property so that we see the correct icons showing up in our UI. Okay, let's try this out. Oh, something happened. Ah, it didn't work. Let's go see why this didn't work. Let's see if index equals state.currentTrackIndex. We want to call toggle play. Oh, it works on the bottom, not on the track item. Interesting. Oh, that is interesting. Let's go see why that is. Track list calls music.playTrack. Player controls. Music is playing. Oh, this just calls music.togglePlay. So something, wrap the rest of code in playTrack. Yes. Thank you. You're right. We don't want to. What was happening is all of this was still being run, even though this was happening. So we check to see if index.state.currentTrackIndex matches. It did. Toggle play happened. But then all the rest of this code happened, which we don't want it to. So this is the else block for this condition here. Thank you. 55 points to Allison for that one. Yay. That actually would have taken me a while to find. Okay, let's try this. Woo! There we go. Okay, we're almost done. We just need to hook up our previous and next functions here. All right. So previous play track. This is kind of interesting. We need to solve for a couple things here. We're going to do kind of this logic here. Maybe not create a new audio player, but we do need to, or more like this object here. We need to set up our current track index, set is playing to true. So, and we need to, well, let's do this. Let's say, in the end, we're going to call play track and let play track take care of playing the next track. So in the end, we're going to say play track. And we could say something like state.currentTrackIndex plus 1, right? But that's only going to work for 2 of our scenarios here. We could go here, click next. Okay. Let's talk through this and then we'll work on the examples. We could have this one playing. Click next, it'll play the hipsta. Click next, it'll play tobu. But then once we get here, we want to wrap back to index 0. Oh, previous track, thank you. Lots of things happening. Anyway, so same thing here. If we're playing tobu, we click previous. It'll play hipsta. We click previous. It'll play Lost Chameleon. Then we'll get to index -1. Right? We're going to take 0 minus 1, and it'll go to -1. So we're going to set this up. We're going to say let new track index equal, and we're going to set up a conditional here. We say is state.currentTrackIndex equal to 0. If we're playing the first song in the list, then we want to set new state track index to 2. So if we're playing the first song in the list, then we want new, we want new track index to equal 2. Otherwise, we want it to equal state dot current track index minus 1. Now, instead of just saying hard coding our logic here, we're going to get new track index, pass that into play track. Hey, woo! Very cool. Okay, we're gonna do the same thing in play next track. Let new track index equal state dot current track index. We're just gonna do our logic backwards. If it equals state dot tracks dot length, this will help us. Well, this is hard coded to 2. We should change this out, which we'll do in a second. If we want to add more and more songs to this list, we don't always want to have to come in and change this hard-coded index number every time we add a new song. So we're just going to set this to state.tracks.length minus 1. That gives us the index for the last item. So we're going to check for play next track, we're going to check to see if the current track index is the last song. If it is, then we're going to set current track index to 0. We can hard code that one because that's always going to be the first song. Otherwise, we're going to say state.current track index plus 1. Now both of these can be dynamic, doesn't matter how big our track list is. We're always going to go to the end of the track list here when we're at 0 and we click play previous. And when we're at the end of the track list, we're always going to go to, if we're at the end of the track list, we're going to go to the first. So last test, let's see if this works. Oh no. Let's see, what did we do here? Oh, we need to call play track still. And new track index. Thank you, Joshua. 10 points. Woo! Yes, we got it. Whew. And just in time because we've gone over time a bit. Okay. Again, this is a pretty complicated example for context. This is a really cool example with hooks, right? With the custom hook that we built. This is not something that you need to be able to set up for your afternoon project today, for the sprint project. We could go a little bit deeper today because context API isn't very involved. So the first guided project we did really gave you everything you need for the, hey, it's working, it's working. The first guided project we did gave you everything you need for your project today. So let's take a look at the project. You will download, fork, and clone this project, and then open it up, and you'll have a completely working project. So everything will be working. You'll be able to add objects to your shopping cart, but it's all working with props. So your task is to start, remove all the instances of props and passing props down, put data onto different context objects, and then use context to share data across here. Steve, that came from this project here. So I think at the very bottom of this is the GitHub for this. somewhere in here you can either get the Code Sandbox or the GitHub. Oh, here you go. bensound.com. Anyways, yeah, that is found in the README for the guided project. There's the link right there. Okay, so go build some context and have fun with today's project. If you finish, then don't forget the stretch problems here. If you finish all of these stretch problems by the end of the day today, your TLs and I will figure out something fun for you to work on. So good luck and have a wonderful day. Oh wait, let's see if there's questions. Hold on. Okay, feel free to jump off if you want to go to lunch. If there's any questions that come in the next minute or so, then I'll answer questions. Have a great day. Okay, we just mentioned this, where's the audio API being imported from? Gotcha, not the songs. Okay, so audio API is part of JavaScript, actually. So you can call new audio, and let's open up MDM audio. Sounds like my son is having a tough time upstairs. Web Audio API. So you can go to the Web Audio API and read more about that here. Let's see if there is something specific. Using the Web Audio API, there's a code pen, audio context. You can do this inside HTML. No, this isn't what I'm looking for. Let's say MDN audio. Web audio buffer. Where is the audio element? Okay, here we go. New sound, you can pass in a URL string. That's cool too. So here is some documentation on that. That's all we've got. So if you've got other questions, feel free to reach out to myself or your TLs or your wonderful section leads as well. And yeah, have a great afternoon.